Welcome to the Fantasy Audiobook. American Comics. The Beginning of the Fusion of the Motherland. Chapter 61. Come on, Rorschach. Come on, though. Eric's eyes were flashing with a trace of crazy excitement, and Rorschach brought him great pressure that he had not seen for a long time. This made Eric's muscles all over his body tense up, and his nerves were in a state of high tension. Eric felt a little out of breath, but that's what Eric wanted. Bang bang bang. Dang dang dang. Just like that, amidst the rhythmic sound of metal collision, Rorschach forcibly opened a path and came to Eric. He raised his iron fist and punched Eric hard. Eric only felt suffocated. At that moment, it was like a wild beast rushing toward him. His pupils suddenly contracted, and adrenaline suddenly came up. Drink. With this low shout, Eric suddenly controlled a reinforced concrete block as big as a person and smashed it towards Rorschach. It was impossible for Eric to control such a large thing with such dexterity and precision before. Boom. The next moment, gravel burst out, and the reinforced concrete block was instantly exploded by Rorschach's punch. It exploded into rubble. Laugh. At this time, the heat rays in Rorschach's eyes also shot towards Eric. Eric's anus suddenly contracted. The hairs on my body stood up. He smelled something approaching death. Under that kind of extreme stimulation, Eric's reaction really reached an extraordinary level. At that critical moment, he once again controlled a steel pipe blocked in front of himself. When the heat ray hit the steel pipe directly. However, Eric only blocked the direct attack of the heat ray, but could not block the indirect attack of the heat ray. Because the steel pipe flew backwards under the huge impact of the heat ray. It hit Eric with a bang. Eric flipped over and hit the ground hard with a loud, plop, sound. It hurts just looking at it. But Eric didn't seem to feel it. He got up from the ground and shouted to Rorschach, "Come again, continue. Just keep it like this, Rorschach." I really can't tell that Eric still has masochistic tendencies. Rorschach cursed slightly, and without being polite to Eric, he rushed towards him again. Ever since. Bang bang bang. Bang bang bang. Eric was knocked to the ground again and again by Rorschach, and soon his nose was bruised and his face was swollen. Of course, Rorschach was very measured in his actions. Eric only looked miserable, but in fact he was not really injured. Eric was beaten too badly, wasn't he? Is Rorschach already so powerful? Poor Eric. The young mutants around were stunned, shaking their heads and sighing. Originally, they hoped to see a wonderful showdown between Eric and Rorschach, but it turned out to be a one-sided bloody battle. Everyone had guessed that Rorschach's strength had surpassed Eric's, but the gap between the two sides was so big that it caught everyone off guard. Charles couldn't help but shook his head repeatedly. Although Eric had been beaten badly, Charles could tell at a glance that Rorschach had let go. No, to be more precise, it was released into the sea. Otherwise, Eric would have died 800 times. However, looking at Eric's appearance, he looks a little embarrassed, but I have to say, it seems to be really useful. Alex, Sean, Darwin, you guys, together with Eric, attack Rorschach. Charles made this decision immediately and said to the young mutants who were watching the excitement. The mutants were stunned for a moment, and then each of them became excited. Rorschach, I really want to learn a lesson. The Ravager let out a ghostly cry, then his chest suddenly rose, and a wave of energy hit Rorschach. Whoosh. But Rorschach's body just swayed, and a shadow was left on the spot, and he hid on the other side in the blink of an eye. The siren was waiting aside. He opened his mouth and fired a sound wave towards Rorschach. Whoosh. But Luo Sha swayed and disappeared again. What speed is this, Rorschach? Is it too exaggerated? Both Raven and Hank were dumbfounded. With such an exaggerated speed, even if Rorschach doesn't take action and is just used as a target, no one can hurt Rorschach, right? Caught you. A voice sounded, but it was Darwin who suddenly appeared from behind and grabbed Rorschach. Of course, he didn't know that this was Rorschach's intention. Click, click, click. Then Darwin's body suddenly turned into a statue, imprisoning Rorschach. The remaining people naturally seized this extremely rare opportunity and launched their own attacks on Rorschach. Energy waves, sound waves, and Eric's metal covered Rorschach in an instant. However, Rorschach grabbed Darwin with one hand and lifted Darwin up with just a slight force. Just like throwing away garbage, it was thrown dozens of meters away. At this time, the attack had already arrived in front of them, blocking the escape routes of Rorschach and the other two, leaving them with no escape. I'm sure I can hit you now, right? The faces of the destroyer, the siren, and Darwin, who was thrown out, all showed a smile. But soon, the smiles on everyone's faces froze. Crack. But there was such a loud noise, and Rorschach exerted force with his feet, and stepped on the ground to create a big hole. Then Rorschach's body rose directly from the ground and jumped more than 10 meters high. All the attacks just ran away from Rorschach's feet. They didn't touch Rorschach at all. All the mutants were dumbfounded. How could they do this? Guys, I was only going to beat Eric, but what can I say? You asked for it. After Rorschach fell to the ground again, he glanced at the young mutants and grinned. Several mutants couldn't help but shudder. They glanced at Eric's embarrassed look and shook their heads like rattles. Rorschach, Charles asked us to do it. Don't come over here. Haha, this is not up to you. Bang bang bang, bang bang bang. Don't. The training ground suddenly became lively. When everything calmed down, all the mutants on the scene, except Charles and the others who did not participate in the battle, lay on the ground. They were like mud, limp on the ground and couldn't get up. On this day, they truly experienced the horror of Rorschach. Facts have proved that practice is always the best teacher. Although Eric and his friends felt a little embarrassed when they were ravaged by Rorschach, after careful consideration, they all found that they had made significant progress. There is really a difference between having pressure and not having pressure. Well, if that's the case, then everyone, let's add practical lessons to our training in the future. After seeing that this method was effective, Charles happily made such a decision. Come again. The mutants all pulled their faces long and shook their heads subconsciously like rattles. They didn't want to experience the fear of being dominated by Rorschach again. That's it, Eric agreed without thinking. Everyone, go back and rest well. I hope I won't be beaten so badly by Rorschach tomorrow. After that, Eric ignored the mutants, patted his butt, and turned away. Did you hear what Eric said? Charles spread his hands. Good luck to you. He left in the same cool manner, leaving only a bunch of mutants looking at each other, messy in the wind. But soon, Darwin stood up suddenly, turned around and walked out. Darwin, where are you going? The siren stretched his head and shouted behind him. Training. You all heard what Charles and Eric said. Darwin walked away with big strides, leaving only this sentence floating over. What should we do? What else can we do? Accept our fate. The Ravager, Siren and others exchanged opinions with each other a little helplessly, and accepted such a helpless fate. In fact, they also agreed with this approach in their hearts, but they just refused to admit it. Since then, the mutants began a long career dominated by Rorschach's fear. But it must be said that since joining the practical class, the progress of the mutants is still very obvious, and the training efficiency has been greatly improved. In just 10 days, the strength of the mutants has changed significantly. Most of the childishness on his body has faded, and he looks more like a mature warrior. When he went to Manhattan to capture Shao, if the mutants were in this state, Charles would not have so many concerns, but would have considered taking everyone with him at the beginning. On the playground, each mutant was doing his own training, while Charles, Eric and Rorschach stood together, watching everyone's training results. The expressions on their faces were still quite gratified. As for Mora, she was gone again. Although Mora accidentally fell into Shao's trap last time and brought everyone into the pit, this did not stop Mora from investigating Shao. It just made her more cautious and careful, that's all. But as always, Rorschach still didn't think much of Mora. Because the situation between the United States and the Soviet Union is becoming more and more serious, as the mastermind behind the scenes, Shao will definitely focus more on provoking a war between the two countries at this moment. How could they show up so easily? Charles, they are ready now. Eric's voice sounded, and he spoke to Charles. Yes, Eric, they are ready. Charles also nodded. Charles, who has always been more conservative, now has to admit this. And all this is thanks to Rorschach. At this time, Charles set his eyes on Rorschach, with a face full of praise. Without your whip, Rorschach, everyone would not have made such rapid progress. Yes, this is really a powerful whip. Eric subconsciously touched his cheek as he spoke, and there is still a bruise there. Rorschach, This kid, I told him not to hold back, but he really didn't know how to be polite to me. Eric, don't look at me with that look, in fact, I am also injured. My fist hurts a lot when it hits your face. Rorschach accused Eric seriously. You guy. Eric looked helpless. This kid really got the advantage and still acted cute. Ha ha ha. Charles laughed. He enjoyed this moment of closeness. It's just a pity that Charles couldn't know that this moment would not last long. Eric, Rorschach, I have an idea. Charles's voice sounded, and he said to the two with a gleam in his eyes, the actual combat training these days has been very effective, so how about I build a special actual combat training room? Let us look more powerful when we get beaten. Eric joked casually. He didn't understand what Charles really meant. No, Eric, I mean, a training room that can simulate various real situations. We can even simulate fighting with Xiao. Although the actual combat training has achieved good results, the model is still too single, and everyone knows that they will not kill each other, which leads to the limitations of this training. There is no way to force everyone's true potential. Charles began to talk freely, describing an idealized training room to Eric and Rorschach. A training room that allows everyone to truly experience the real battlefield and feel the tense moment of life and death. Isn't this a dangerous training room? Rorschach couldn't help but secretly complain. This thing will be standard in the future Xavier Youth Academy, and even the X-Men will simulate the battle with the Sentinel robot here. Who would have thought that it would be born in advance by accident? While chatting with Eric and Charles, a reminder sound suddenly sounded on the watch worn on Rorschach's wrist. Rorschach looked down and a message popped up. Found the key clues of mechanical life forms, hope to meet and talk. In this era, this kind of watch can be called black technology, but considering that it was specially left by Howard Stark for Rorschach to communicate, it is not surprising. After all, Howard Stark was a jerk who could make a floating car during World War II, and the communication watch was not worth mentioning. Charles, Eric, you led everyone to train first, I need to go out to deal with something. Rorschach made a decision without much hesitation. He said hello to Charles and the others and planned to go to the appointment. Rorschach was the one who facilitated the investigation of Decepticons by S.H.I.E.L.D. for the Allspark, so he would not hesitate to give it another push at the critical moment. And staying in Xavier Manor all day would undoubtedly not trigger the mission, so there was really nothing to worry about. After saying hello to Charles Eric, Rorschach left Xavier Manor. He came to a luxurious private room in a high-end hotel and met Howard Stark. What surprised Rorschach a little was that not only Howard Stark was there, but Peggy Carter was also there. Rorschach glanced at Howard Stark and then at Peggy Carter, as if he had discovered something extraordinary. A man and a woman alone in a hotel. What's going on? What are you doing standing at the door? Why don't you come in? Howard Stark was sorting clothes in the closet and said to Rorschach casually. Then he looked up and saw Rorschach's meaningful eyes. He suddenly smiled bitterly. What are you thinking about, kid? Howard Stark waved to Rorschach. Come in quickly, there's something important. Rorschach naturally knew that the two of them had something important to do in the hotel, and he was just teasing Howard Stark on purpose. Of course, it's not that Rorschach believes in the character of this playboy. Rorschach thinks it's not strange that Howard Stark really attacked Peggy Carter. But the key is that Peggy Carter is obviously not someone Howard Stark can deal with. Rorschach walked in, glanced at Peggy Carter, and said something else. Agent Carter is here too. I hope someone who is not afraid of heights can be sent to follow me this time. Peggy Carter's face immediately became as ugly as an eggplant. Last time she sent someone to follow Rorschach, not only was he discovered, but he also threw the person onto the roof. He even sent a message to threaten her. Peggy Carter was so angry that her face was slapped so hard. Rorschach, do you know what the crime of attacking a national law enforcement officer is? Peggy Carter said to Rorschach with a cold face. I don't care. Rorschach spread his hands, but I really want to know what crime it is to attack a senior officer of an intelligence agency, such as a senior executive of the Strategic Homeland Defense Attack and Logistics Support Agency. Peggy Carter almost exploded. Isn't this obviously talking about herself? Peggy, Rorschach, calm down, we are all family, and the previous things were all misunderstandings. Why are you so sharp-tongued? Howard Stark saw that something was wrong with this situation, and immediately jumped out to smooth things over. Howard Stark knew that Peggy Carter had some prejudice against Rorschach because she misunderstood Rorschach, and even sent someone to follow Rorschach, but Howard Stark explained it to Peggy Carter afterwards. At the last secret meeting of the three founders, Howard Stark told everyone the information about the mutants. Afterwards, after an investigation by S.H.I.E.L.D., it was confirmed that this matter was indeed true. Peggy Carter completely misunderstood Rorschach. But even so, with Peggy Carter's pride, it is impossible for her to express her opinion to Rorschach because of a small misunderstanding. At most, she will not investigate Rorschach anymore, that's all. Given Peggy Carter's status and position, she felt that she had made a big concession by doing this. She did not pursue the fact that her agent was beaten into the hospital. But who would have thought that Rorschach would be sarcastic and even threaten her as soon as he saw her? How could Peggy Carter bear it? Rorschach, Peggy didn't follow you before because she was targeting you. She just misunderstood you about something, but now the misunderstanding has been explained. She will never target you again in the future. Howard Stark explained to Rorschach, and then pulled Peggy Carter aside and persuaded her. This appeased Peggy Carter. Mr. Stark, I don't know what you want to talk to me about, but I don't want to talk about things if I'm not in a good mood. And when I see someone I don't want to see, I'll be in a very bad mood, just like now. But Rorschach didn't intend to let it go. Rorschach, please, have some of the grace that a man should have. Howard Stark was in a state of panic. If you are so fussy, you won't be able to please girls. It doesn't matter. Rorschach looked indifferent. Anyway, it's girls who please me. Howard Stark. Rorschach, you are a bit too pretentious. Even this playboy doesn't dare to say such words. Rorschach. Stark. Peggy Carter interrupted Howard Stark on the side. She is a tolerant person who can make self-sacrifices for the overall situation. You'd better hope that you can gain something this time. After saying this, Peggy Carter slammed the door and walked out without looking back. Only Rorschach and Howard Stark were left in the room. Rorschach. Mr. Stark, the old woman is gone, you won't still lecture me, right? Rorschach glanced at Howard Stark. No, I mean, it's not something that an average man can do to make Peggy so angry. Howard Stark patted Rorschach's shoulder, then shook his head and sighed. Actually, Peggy is also a poor person. Mr. Stark, why don't you save this poor person? Rorschach, how can you have such an idea? Rogers is my friend. Then you should help your friend even more. Do you think so too? Rorschach's eyes widened. Howard Stark actually had such an idea. What a beast. Ahem, let's talk business, let's talk business. After a dry cough to cover up his embarrassment, Howard Stark slapped a suit that had been prepared long ago into Rorschach's hands. What is this for? Put it on first, and we'll talk while walking. Howard Stark said to Rorschach, and he was also tidying up his clothes in front of the mirror. No, Mr. Stark, you'd better talk now. I'm afraid you'll sell me out. You kid. Howard Stark shook his head helplessly. He really didn't understand why Rorschach was so casual when facing him. The founder of S.H.I.E.L.D., a super rich man, which of his identities is not a big boss? Many well-known people are cautious in front of him. As a result, this Rorschach seems to have completely regarded himself as a low-ranking character. Of course, this is just a complaint. Howard Stark actually likes this relaxed and free atmosphere. 3 days ago, our people found a car suspected to be UB6. UB6, oh, it's the code name of the mechanical life form you found last time. Rorschach, you were right, that car is indeed a mechanical life form. We have studied this mechanical life form and found that not only does this life form itself have energy radiation of a specific frequency, but some objects it has come into contact with also contain this energy radiation. Just 3 days ago, my colleague detected this radiation in General Ross's car. When Howard Stark said this, Rorschach completely understood the other party's intention. Because there will be energy radiation on both the Decepticons and the objects that the Decepticons have come into contact with, so simply detecting energy radiation can only mean that General Ross's car is suspected. But he couldn't be sure that the car was a Decepticon. Under normal circumstances, regardless of whether he is a Decepticon or not, S.H.I.E.L.D. can take the car directly back for research and investigation. But not now. The owner of the car has an unusual identity, he is a general. Therefore, Howard Stark must first confirm that the car is a Decepticon before he can take the next step. The only person with the ability to confirm the identity of the Decepticons is undoubtedly Rorschach. This is why Howard Stark invited Rorschach over. Rorschach understood everything. No, wait a minute. But the next moment, Luo Shaw's expression changed, and he suddenly discovered something. General Ross. Rorschach stared directly at Howard Stark. There won't be any direct relationship between this General Ross and the future General Ross, or Secretary of State Ross, right? Wilson Ross, Air Force Lieutenant General of the 7th Formation of the Western Air Defense Zone, what's the problem? Howard Stark was a little surprised by Rorschach's reaction. Wilson Ross, does he have a son? Rorschach thought for a while and continued to ask such a question. General Ross does have a son. If I remember correctly, he should be 13 years old this year. Rorschach, do you know General Ross? Howard Stark was very surprised. Do you know what his son's name is? Let me think about it. It should be Thaddeus E. Ross. Have to. It's really that General Ross. If Rorschach was asked to think about the name of General Ross alone, he would naturally not be able to recall it, but if others mentioned it, Rorschach would still be able to distinguish it. That is Hulk's lifelong enemy. In other words, will I see Hulk's father-in-law who is still a child this time? It seems quite interesting. What's wrong, Rorschach? Howard Stark's voice sounded, and he looked directly at Rorschach and asked. It's nothing, I just think the name sounds familiar. I must have recognized it by mistake. Rorschach waved his hand and gently dropped the topic, then stared at Howard Stark and asked, Mr. Stark, can I ask how many Ob-6s you have found? Then Rorschach saw a look of embarrassment on Howard Stark's face. Rorschach, things are not as simple as you think. We knew nothing about UB-6 before, and even the detector to detect Ob-6 was just developed. Howard Stark's face darkened slightly as he explained to Rorschach. You can just say that none of them have been found, Mr. Stark. Rorschach interrupted Howard Stark. Howard Stark, this kid really can't speak. In other words, the information about Megatron, what kind of cold place, etc., was not investigated. Rorschach, these are the secrets of the Bureau. Even I cannot reveal them at will. Rorschach knew for sure that S.H.I.E.L.D. had indeed found nothing through its investigation. These rubbish. With this progress, when will we be able to find out the key clue that Megatron is hiding in the North and South Pole? So Rorschach, as long as we can catch Ob-6 this time, I believe we will gain a lot. Howard Stark's voice sounded, and he said to Rorschach seriously. Well, in order for S.H.I.E.L.D. to find Megatron earlier, what else could Rorschach do? He could only silently send a wave of assists to these pig teammates. Another more important point is to see if any tasks can be triggered during this process. Rorschach made a decision quickly. He didn't say any more nonsense, took the suit handed over by Howard Stark and put it on smoothly. Wow, Rorschach, I suddenly regret calling you over. Howard Stark looked at the young and handsome boy who appeared in front of him, with a hint of jealousy on his face. You will steal all my limelight. Mr. Stark, are you just realizing this now? Rorschach raised his eyebrows at Howard Stark very coquettishly. You know, Rorschach, you have the cool feeling I had back then. Howard Stark spread his hands. Really? Then I don't feel honored. You should. The two sides were chatting about whether they had love or not, and Howard Stark took Rorschach to the underground garage and in front of a silver Mercedes-Benz. Mercedes-Benz 220 SE, this is the tailfin model just launched by Mercedes-Benz. How about it? Is it cool? Oh, of course we can't forget that this is the first car to combine energy-absorbing deformation zones with a rigid body. It's a very forward-looking design. Howard Stark once again introduces Rorschach with a hint of showiness. It's a pity that this car, just like the original Cadillac, is still very old-fashioned in Rorschach's eyes. But it shouldn't be UB6, right? Howard Stark also joked. You sound like you hope it is. Rorschach responded casually and got into the passenger seat. Howard Stark suddenly started the car, leaving a trail of smoke and dust on the spot, which quickly disappeared. Almost 40 minutes later, Howard Stark's luxury car stopped at the door of a very luxurious villa. This is exactly Howard Stark's destination this time. In this villa, a trade fair among celebrities is being held. Those who received invitations were all bigwigs from all walks of life in the United States. According to Howard Stark's information, There were items of interest to the military in this auction, so Wilson Ross would also participate. Mr. Stark. It's Mr. Stark. Mr. Stark is here. As soon as Howard Stark got out of the car, a large number of reporters rushed over to take pictures. The spotlights kept flashing, making people unable to open their eyes. Especially when reporters from all walks of life saw that Howard Stark, who had always been a romantic man, was not bringing a female companion this time, but another young man. They were even more keenly aware of something. Kakaka also kept taking photos of Rorschach. Everyone was very curious about Rorschach's identity and came over to interview Howard Stark and Rorschach. Howard Stark couldn't help but have a smile on his face, and couldn't help but look at Rorschach beside him with helpless eyes. It's all this kid's fault for driving away his female companion in anger, making him, Howard Stark, a different person in everyone's eyes. However, Howard Stark had long been accustomed to this kind of situation. With a smile on his face, he calmly walked into the villa lobby under the escort of the villa security guards. The soothing music made people feel relaxed unconsciously, as if clear and warm spring water was flowing. Walking in the magnificent hall that looked like a crystal palace, Rorschach even thought for a moment that he had returned to the 21st century instead of the 1960s. To be honest, the luxury of this villa was beyond Rorschach's expectations. Except that the overall style and shape of some places seemed old-fashioned due to the limitations of the times, this place was actually the most upscale place Rorschach had ever visited in his 2 lifetimes. Looking around, he saw that the people walking in and out of the hall were all celebrities in suits and leather shoes, with extraordinary demeanor. Their hair was combed meticulously, and their leather shoes were polished to a shine, which was called bright and beautiful. They walked in every corner of the hall with confident and elegant steps, with polite but fake smiles on their faces. Is this your first time in a place like this? Howard Stark saw Rorschach looking around and couldn't help asking from the side. Rorschach nodded. There was nothing to hide about this kind of thing. How do you feel? Howard Stark stared at Rorschach with interest and asked. How do you feel? It's a pity that such a good place is not hit by Hulk. Rorschach thought for a while and said seriously. Hulk, what the hell? Howard Stark was confused. Could it be that he was really old and couldn't understand some popular memes of young people? Howard Stark, Mr. Stark. Just when Rorschach wanted to ask what the Hulk was, many people around him came over to greet Howard Stark. Each of them was very respectful. Even in such a place where celebrities gathered, Howard Stark was one of the most handsome guys in the crowd. Mr. Stark, I'll just walk around by myself. Seeing Howard Stark fallen into the crowd, Rorschach said hello to him and walked around the luxurious hall by himself. An informal trade fair is being held here, and some display cabinets can be seen in various places in the hall. In the display cabinets are some messy and strange things, antiques, magic stones, ancient swords, and so on. In order to let everyone better know and understand these things, each display cabinet is also posted with a sign to introduce what is in the display cabinet. Rorschach looked at this and that, feeling like visiting a rare museum, but not bored. Leibniz's notebook. Leibniz published the first calculus paper in 1684, defining the concept of calculus. This note records the whole process of Leibniz's overthrow of calculus. These top rich people are still interested in this thing. The Wright brothers' pocket watch. The airplane is one of the greatest inventions in history, but great success is inseparable from the watering of sweat. Behind the successful flight of the Flyer 1, there are countless experiments by the Wright brothers. This pocket watch is the one that the Wright brothers used to test the flight. Rorschach looked carefully at the display case and found that the watch had stopped moving a long time ago. Count Dracula's ring. Count Dracula. Rorschach's face showed an interested look. This is a famous character. This character has been portrayed in countless literary works, and even Dracula in Marvel. Oh my God. Thinking of this, Rorschach's expression moved. Maybe there really is Count Dracula in this world. After all, there are werewolves in this world. As we all know, werewolves and vampires always appear in pairs. If there are werewolves, there must be vampires. If there are vampires, then it is not surprising that Count Dracula exists. Special energy source detected. At this moment, Luo Sha's mind once again heard the system's prompt. At the same time, his vision was once again switched to the scanning vision. The ancient-looking ring in the display cabinet was marked by the system. Analyzing the energy source. Energy value. 276 origin points. Status, extractable. Extractable. Luo Sha's eyes lit up, not to mention how excited he was. This was really a pleasant surprise for him. Originally, he was just trying his luck to see if he could trigger the task, but who would have thought that he would encounter a special energy source again, and it was still in an extractable state. Doesn't this mean that as long as Luo Sha gets this ring, he can get 276 origin points for nothing? Not bad. System, extract the special energy source. After Luo Sha calmed down his excitement, he tried to give the system such a command. Extracting. Extraction failed. Extraction failed. Is it? I need to touch the special energy source. Rorschach thought about it and felt that it was very possible. Telekinesis was indeed a bit of a cheat. In that case, then buy this ring. Rorschach made a decision. Thinking of this, he began to look elsewhere, looking for the figure of the playboy. He didn't bring much money this time, so he had to borrow some money from the playboy first. However, Rorschach looked and found that Howard Stark was still talking and laughing with a group of people, and was also flirting with a few girls. He knew that he had to wait for a while. Howard Stark, this guy, wouldn't he forget the mission after seeing the girls? Rorschach secretly complained, and then retracted his gaze, looking at the ring in the display case with some curiosity. In Rorschach's opinion, it was actually an ordinary ring, and the shape was so ugly. Rorschach was really surprised that this ring was also a special energy source. Looking at the introduction of the ring again, or the statements of the Archduke of the Impaler, there was nothing new. You seem to be very interested in this ring. At this time, a voice suddenly sounded coldly. A man wearing a windbreaker, with long hair and a classical aristocratic temperament, stood beside Rorschach without knowing when. Rorschach was really shocked, because before the man spoke, he did not notice any movement. And with Rorschach's current strength, this is almost impossible. This classical man is definitely not an ordinary person. Rorschach made a judgment in the first instant. And the next moment, Rorschach's pupils shrank slightly, because he suddenly found that on the smooth glass surface of the display cabinet, there was only his own reflection, but not the reflection of the classical man. What's the situation? Ghost. As a native of China, Luo Sha subconsciously felt his scalp numb the first moment he saw this strange phenomenon, and an idea flashed through his mind unconsciously. How can a living person have no shadow? Isn't this a joke? Etc. Wrong. But in an instant, another name flashed through Rorschach's mind: vampire. He seemed to remember that in Western legends, vampires were shadowless beings who would not show their reflections when looking in the mirror. Because shadows and reflections are symbols of the soul, and vampires are soulless creatures. Could it be that the person next to me is a vampire? Thinking about the very classical-looking figure next to him, Luo Sha felt that the latter guess was more reliable. Call. Rorschach couldn't help but secretly breathe a sigh of relief. It's just good that he's a vampire. Although vampires are a very scary existence for ordinary people, and are even supernatural beings, they are not enough to be seen in front of Rorschach. Even if he doesn't use a powerful weapon like heat rays, he can crush a vampire to death just by relying on his powerful physical strength. Only, vampires are afraid of seeing the sun, but now it's clear sky and daylight. What's going on with this vampire next to me? Not afraid of the sun. He seems to be an extraordinary being. When sorting out his knowledge about vampires, and also considering the background of Marvel, Rorschach can think of only one vampire who is so awesome: Dracula. Could it be that this person next to me is Dracula? That's why the other party appears here, because there is Dracula's ring here. Moreover, the system has just verified for Rorschach that the ring is actually a special energy source, which means that it is very likely that the ring really belongs to Dracula. Based on all these clues, Rorschach felt that the possibility that the person next to him was Dracula was very, very high. In fact, Rorschach guessed well. The person beside him was indeed Count Dracula, the ancestor of vampires who holds a unique and extraordinary position in the history of vampires. Of course, the setting in Marvel is no longer the ancestor, but at best a second-generation ancestor. I go. Did Dracula even show up? It is indeed the world of Marvel, with all kinds of strange powers and chaotic gods. Rorschach was secretly stunned in his heart, but he quickly put away the messy thoughts in his mind, and said to Dracula calmly, "I just took a look, I can't say I'm interested. Would you like to take a look?" Dracula smiled. He really looked like a gentleman, slow and gentle, and also revealed a kind of elegance. I have to say, if you put aside Dracula's identity and just look at his appearance, talking to such a person really makes people feel like a spring breeze. But after knowing Dracula's identity, well, Rorschach only felt full of vigilance. Although he can only be ranked second, he is still a boss-level figure. "Yeah, just take a look, this ring looks quite interesting." Rorschach nodded and agreed with the other party seriously. Just when Rorschach was about to leave with a few perfunctory words, Dracula suddenly looked at Rorschach with a very sure tone and said, "You are lying." Rorschach was very wary. Is this old monster so sharp? He secretly thought that his performance just now didn't seem so fake, right? There are no obvious flaws exposed. "Sir, you are saying something incomprehensible. I have something else to do. Please excuse me." Too many words lead to mistakes, so Luo Sha didn't say anything more to the other party. He responded with a polite smile and turned around to leave. Dracula did not stop Rorschach, and just let Rorschach leave. It wasn't until Rorschach's figure was lost in the crowd that Dracula withdrew his gaze. He said to himself with great interest, "It seems that he really recognized this ring, which is interesting." But then, Dracula turned his attention to the ring in front of him, with a gentle look on his face. It was as if he was talking to an old friend of his. "It's been so many years, I never thought I would see you again." Then he reached out and touched the ring through the glass of the showcase. And that ring seemed to feel some kind of call, and it began to shine with a long light. Shining like a gem, Dracula's ring lit up. What happened? I remember, that was a ring. The movement of the ring quickly attracted the attention of some surrounding guests. Everyone came over to watch in surprise and talked non-stop. That ring is really not an ordinary item. Luo Sha, who was not far away, also saw this scene and secretly thought that it was indeed the case. But he couldn't help but frown slightly. Now it is basically certain that the man is Dracula, which means that the ring in the display cabinet belongs to Dracula. Could it be that next, Rorschach is going to take away things that originally belonged to others from Dracula's hands? Luo Sha felt that this matter needed to be discussed in the long term. Although the ring was a special energy source that he had been thinking about, there were other ways to obtain the origin points, and the ring was not the only one. If he had to fight a legendary figure like Dracula because of just over 200 energy sources, he should at least think carefully. Rorschach fell into deep thought. At this time, as the vision of the ring attracted more and more people, Dracula finally stopped feeling nostalgic and took his hand back. The originally flashing ring quickly dimmed. But this scene made everyone around him marvel and attracted more and more attention. Because it seemed too coincidental, it proved that the ring was shining because of that man. All eyes were fixed on Dracula. This made Rorschach even more upset. Now the ring had become the focus of everyone's attention. Even if Dracula did not intend to take back the ring, I am afraid that this thing would be snatched by everyone afterwards. This was very disadvantageous to Rorschach. Of course, Rorschach thought this situation was unlikely, because from the current situation, Dracula seemed to be coming for the ring. I just don't know what Dracula is going to do now that everyone is watching. And soon, Rorschach knew the answer. Under Rorschach's gaze, Dracula suddenly opened his mouth and blew out a large mouthful of white air. The white air did not dissipate, but quickly expanded, just like dry ice released on the stage, and quickly spread throughout the hall. It swept all the guests like a tide. Plop, plop. Then the guests fell to the ground one after another. What kind of move is this? The strange scene in front of him could be said to have caught Rorschach off guard. By the way, isn't Dracula a vampire? When did a vampire have such cheating skills? But if you think about Dracula in Marvel, well, Rorschach can only say that Dracula in Marvel is indeed a bit unreasonable. Unafraid of sunlight, super speed regeneration, and immortality. The immortal body here is truly immortal. Every time Dracula is killed, he will definitely be resurrected. This kind of immortality is like the law of the universe. Even the death of one of the 5 creation gods of the universe cannot kill Dracula. In addition, Dracula can also atomize, control wind and rain, summon lightning, transform into a bat, a werewolf, and can hypnotize. etc., etc. Just cheat. So it seems that such a cheating existence, spewing white gas from his mouth that can make people fall to the ground, is not a big deal. I just don't know what kind of white gas this is. When those random thoughts flashed through his mind, the white aura that quickly filled the air came to the surroundings, drowning Rorschach's body. But Rorschach was not an ordinary person after all. He closed his breathing immediately to avoid inhaling those dangerous gases. Not only that, at this moment, Rorschach's useless mutant ability that had been sitting in the corner for a long time finally came into play. He filters out the gases released by Dracula through his skin and directly absorbs the oxygen in the surrounding air. In this way, Dracula's trick was perfectly solved. Hey, interesting, a voice suddenly sounded, but Dracula did not know when he appeared in front of Rorschach, and he stared at Rorschach quite unexpectedly. I didn't expect that anyone could still be standing well at this time. Rorschach noticed that Dracula's finger had already put on the ring that was originally placed in the display cabinet. Rorschach had guessed well before, Dracula was indeed here for his ring. My hypnosis doesn't work on you. You are not an ordinary person. Dracula looked directly at Rorschach, looking at Rorschach with great interest. Well, maybe I drank a little too much coffee before. Rorschach calmly responded to Dracula while thinking secretly. Looking at Dracula's current extraordinary performances, as well as this guy's immortality, no matter how you look at it, it is very stupid to fight against this kind of person. And, that ring was not his in the first place. Rorschach made a decision. Listen, no matter who you are or what you want to do, it has nothing to do with me, so if you're done with your business, why don't you just leave? Rorschach said to Dracula, you obviously wanted to get my ring before, and you already recognized who I am, right? A confident smile appeared on Dracula's lips. Although he used interrogative words like, right, Dracula's tone was still very, very sure. I'm not, I didn't, don't talk nonsense. Just kidding, how could such a thing be admitted? Rorschach didn't even think about it and directly denied it decisively. You are dishonest. I don't like dishonest children. Dracula shook his head, and then his body swayed, as if he turned into a gust of wind, and his whole body disappeared directly, sweeping towards Rorschach. In the blink of an eye, he appeared directly in front of Luo Sha, stretched out his right hand and grabbed Luo Sha directly. Although Rorschach was not willing to have any conflict with Dracula at the beginning, but now that people are knocking on his door, what else does Rorschach have to say? He let out a cold snort and punched Dracula directly with the hammer. Boom! A dull crash sounded, but Rorschach used his super speed to avoid Dracula's grasp, and at the same time punched Dracula hard on the chest. Dracula flew backwards like a cannonball. It hit the ground hard. Rorschach's normal power now reaches almost 100 tons, and when it explodes, it will be several times more powerful. Even Dracula couldn't block such a terrifying punch. Dracula in the comics can even kill Captain America, but he is not as strong as Rorschach imagined. Who are you? Dracula got up from the ground again, looking a little embarrassed, and his face was no longer calm, but showed a look of uncontrollable shock. He has lived for so long, but this is the first time he has encountered such a terrifying person. People of the motherland. Rorschach spit out these 3 words from his mouth. People from the motherland. What the hell? How could anyone be called this name? Dracula couldn't help but feel a little angry. Is this kid playing a trick on him? With a sway of his body, he suddenly transformed into a huge evil wolf and rushed towards Luo Sha. Roar! There was also such a low growl coming from his mouth. However, boom! After another punch, the evil wolf fell over completely. He fell to the ground like a dead dog, with a large dent in his chest. I don't even know how many of the sternum bones were broken by Rorschach. Ahem. Dracula then returned to human form, and his sunken chest was recovering at a speed visible to the naked eye. This guy's self-healing ability is even better than Wolverine. Rorschach's punch was terrible, but it did not cause any substantial damage to Dracula. If you want to really hurt Dracula, you must use silver, garlic, or crosses, which are restraints of vampires. That's right, even as the second-generation ancestor of vampires, Dracula himself still cannot jump out of these limitations of vampires. Very shocking power. Dracula's voice sounded, still containing surprise, but he soon sneered, but what if you can't use your power at all? Wow. As Dracula said this, he suddenly turned into a group of bats and flew towards Rorschach. If Rorschach was really just strong, it would be difficult to crack Dracula's move. After all, you can't just punch those bats to death one by one, right? But unfortunately, what Dracula didn't know was that Rorschach's ability was not limited to his fists. Swish! 2 heat rays suddenly burst out from Rorschach's eyes, and he shot them fiercely at the group of bats in the air. After this period of training, Rorschach is now much more proficient in using heat rays than before. Shooting that group of bats was simply easy and pleasant, effortless. Squeak, squeak. Amid the painful cries, bats began to fall one after another like rain. Ah, how could it be? Amidst the painful and shocking cries, the remaining group of bats no longer dared to approach Rorschach. After a whirlwind, it turned into Dracula again. However, at this time, Dracula's face and body were full of traces of burns caused by laser energy, which looked so shocking. And it was obvious that the self-healing speed of those burns had been greatly slowed down. Rorschach's heat rays had fatal damage to Dracula. Dracula was very afraid. "You are not a human, what are you?" Dracula's voice sounded. He looked at Rorschach with a look full of shock and fear, and said in a deep voice, "Anyway, I'm not a dead person." Rorschach shrugged. Dracula on the opposite side couldn't help but twitch slightly. This kid was not indirectly calling him a dead person. Although Dracula is not a living person from a physiological structure, vampires are still more afraid of people holding on to this weakness. This is a kind of irony and insult to them. But now, the insult is an insult. What can Dracula do? He can't beat him. "What are you looking at? Give me the ring. Otherwise, I'll shoot your dog head." Rorschach's voice sounded, and he shouted at Dracula again. Anyway, he had already torn his face with Dracula, so Rorschach would naturally not be polite to Dracula anymore, and would not hide his purpose anymore. Ha, ha, Dracula's chest rose and fell violently, and even the whole person couldn't help but tremble slightly. That was because of Rorschach's anger. He is the second-generation ancestor of vampires, and his status is so transcendent, but he was insulted and threatened by a young boy. Dracula was really angry, the kind of anger that could not be contained. "You really should learn how to respect your elders." Dracula snorted coldly, and then he raised his hands. Crack! A bolt of lightning suddenly fell from the sky and struck Rorschach. Whoosh! But at that moment, Rorschach's body suddenly shook, and he disappeared, appearing in another place like a ghost. The lightning that Dracula summoned hit the ground directly. Swish! At the same time, the heat rays in Rorschach's eyes also shot at Dracula. The heat rays were like garlic, wooden stakes, and silverware, which could greatly restrain and harm Dracula. Even if Dracula had super speed self-healing, he didn't dare to fight hard. Whoosh! Dracula also turned into a residual image, jumping up and down on the ground, dodging left and right, and trying to avoid Rorschach's heat rays in a panic. Indeed, Dracula also has strength and speed far beyond that of ordinary people. Putting aside his vampire attributes, if we only look at his physical fitness, he is definitely a superhuman. But it's a pity. Although Dracula's speed is much faster than that of ordinary people, it is not as fast as Rorschach. That is about 100 meters per second. He has no advantage in front of Rorschach. Want to run? Rorschach's mouth curled up a sneer, and immediately launched his super speed, quickly chasing Dracula, and the heat rays in his eyes chased Dracula non-stop. Crack! Dracula is not a vegetarian either. While dodging quickly, he also summoned some lightning to strike Rorschach. What can he do? Lightning is not Rorschach's heat ray. That thing is far less flexible than heat ray. In addition, every time Dracula attracts lightning, he must make a corresponding attraction action, and the signal should not be too obvious. In this case, it is impossible to hit Rorschach. Whoosh! Rorschach dodged Dracula's lightning with a flash, but the heat rays in his eyes shot directly at Dracula. Dracula staggered and fell to the ground. Rorschach was relentless, and while Dracula was falling, he rushed in front of him. His eyes began to turn red, and he stared at him. Then he waved at Dracula. Ring! Dracula's face suddenly twisted, and his anger seemed to have turned into substance and burst out of his eyes. He had never suffered such a great humiliation. "You want this ring? Okay, in that case, just take it." However, after changing his expression several times, Dracula's face finally returned to normal. He shrugged, took off the ring, and threw it to Rorschach. Although at that moment, Rorschach was a little surprised that Dracula surrendered too easily, as if he was completely unworthy of his status as the second-generation vampire ancestor. But Rorschach didn't think too much, and subconsciously reached out to take the ring. Anyway, the ring was his goal. Even if Dracula really wanted to play any tricks, he had to take the ring first. But what Rorschach didn't expect was that the moment he took the ring, he could clearly feel that there seemed to be an unspeakable power coming from the ring, invading his body crazily. At the same time, the originally dim ring actually lit up again. What's going on? Rorschach was really caught off guard by this situation. Although he didn't understand what was going on with this series of changes, he knew that it was definitely not a good thing. With a glance, Rorschach saw a smile of success on Dracula's face. Rorschach didn't understand that there must be something wrong with this ring. Rorschach didn't care about whether it was a special energy source or not. He suddenly started to shake his hand and was about to throw the ring out. But a strange thing happened. The ring seemed to be glued to Rorschach's hand with a strong adhesive, and he couldn't throw it out at all. Rorschach used his other hand to pick the ring, but the power seemed to be absorbed by the ring and it didn't work at all. It's useless. Once the curse starts, it can't be interrupted by external force. Dracula couldn't help laughing when he saw this scene. He laughed so happily. This is the arrangement of fate. Accept this gift of fate. The undead welcome you. Rorschach ignored Dracula's nonsense. At this critical moment, he became calmer. Since the curse power cannot be countered by brute force, then the only option is to try your own plug-in. Extract the energy source. Rorschach immediately gave such a command to the system. Extracting successfully. Congratulations to the host for obtaining 276 origin points. And soon, a series of prompt sounds flashed through Rorschach's mind. At the same time, the ring that was originally shining in Rorschach's hand quickly dimmed. Even the power that was madly pouring into Rorschach's body was also completely absorbed by the system. Rorschach couldn't help but let out a long sigh of relief. The matter was finally over. The scene just now was really a bit thrilling. The curse is over. Have you felt the changes in your body? Dracula's voice sounded, and he stared at Rorschach seriously, with a hint of expectation in his eyes. As for the hostility and hatred towards Rorschach before, they disappeared completely. It was as if the conflict between the two sides had never happened before. After hearing what Dracula said, Rorschach hurriedly felt his body again, and did not find anything wrong. Only then did he feel relieved. It seems that no matter what the so-called curse is, it has been forcibly interrupted by the system. Now the energy in the ring has been completely absorbed by the system and turned into an ordinary ring. What happened just now? What curse are you talking about? Rorschach pondered for a moment, stared at Dracula and asked. Child, come on, let's sit aside and talk slowly. Dracula's attitude towards Rorschach has completely changed, and he waved to Rorschach with a gentle look. Like an elder, entertaining his juniors. Are you trying to get close to me? Rorschach didn't move, but glanced at Dracula with his eyes slanted. What happened just now was just a wonderful misunderstanding, but now, we are already a family, so you don't have to be so hostile to me. I won't hurt you again, kid. Dracula said to Rorschach with a smile. A family. Recalling what Dracula said before, the undead welcome you, Rorschach thought for a moment and came to a logical conclusion. This ring can curse people into the undead. Rorschach looked at Dracula in surprise. But think about it carefully. Okay, the original vampire in Marvel was indeed born in this way, cursed. Yes, kid. Dracula nodded earnestly. Don't doubt it, you are now a member of the undead, welcome to join. Do you really think so? Rorschach looked at Dracula with suspicion. This old man wouldn't have bad eyesight. Or maybe he was confused. How could he not tell if it was a vampire? Rorschach was full of energy and masculine energy. How could he be an undead? I know your doubts. Don't worry. Let me explain it to you slowly. Dracula seemed to really treat Rorschach as a junior. His attitude was very good. Although this ring can transform people into undead, sometimes, it will not make people change immediately. The specific situation varies from person to person. Some people will become undead immediately after being cursed, but some people's changes are subtle and silent, and they will slowly appear over time. Some people will never show up in their lifetime, but the genes of the undead have already penetrated into his body, but they can't be seen on the surface. For example, in the 5th century AD, I once traveled to Hungary. By chance, a young duke there got my ring and successfully triggered the curse. But he didn't show any changes until a plague broke out in the area decades later, which completely activated his undead identity. Is it like this? Rorschach can be said to be very surprised by this, but this can also explain why Dracula regards himself as a fellow human being even though he is still a thorough human being. But, why does the story of the Duke of Hungary who became an undead because of a plague sound so familiar? During the endless years I traveled around the world, I don't know how many people this ring has fallen into, and most of them cannot trigger the curse. Only a small number of them will trigger the curse, so I say that this is a gift from fate and a destiny from heaven. Among all those who have triggered the curse, I have never seen one with such a strong trigger strength, and even now you can still hold the ring safely, which has never happened before. Child, to some extent, you are unique like me. Dracula's voice became more and more gentle, and he looked at Rorschach with indescribable love. Rorschach, old Dracula completely misunderstood. The reason why he was able to hold the ring safely was not because he was unique, but because the ring was completely useless. But, Rorschach thought about it, it seems that being misunderstood by Dracula is not necessarily a bad thing. This is the ancestor of vampires. Although he is the second-generation ancestor, since the first-generation ancestor is dead, isn't he the ancestor of all vampires? That's a very large group. And in Marvel's setting, vampires have long been integrated into human society. Business, politics, military, all walks of life are infiltrated by vampires. With a relationship like Dracula, it may be very convenient for me in the future. Can I keep this ring? Rorschach thought about it and made this request to Dracula. The ring is now completely useless. If I return it to Dracula, Dracula must not find any flaws. Of course, it is destined to belong to you, so keep it. Dracula was very pleased to see Rorschach ask to keep the ring. It seems that this child has already accepted his identity as an undead. I am very relieved. Generally speaking, I no longer ask about the affairs of the undead, but you are different, so just consider it as a gift from me to you. I remember that there is an ancient castle about 30 kilometers away from here, and there is an undead tribe in the castle. It is the descendant of the Hungarian duke I told you about. You can take this ring and take over that tribe. Okay, kid, I should go. I am looking forward to the day when you really become an undead. At this point, Dracula patted Rorschach on the shoulder and stood up. People here. Rorschach also stood up, glanced at the people around him, and asked Dracula. Don't worry, they are fine. They will wake up in 5 minutes, and they won't remember anything. Dracula waved his hand, then shook his body, turned into a whirlwind, and disappeared. He really came and went in a hurry, without taking a cloud with him. And just as Dracula said, after he left, the people in the hall slowly opened their eyes and got up from the ground. But they all had a trace of confusion on their faces, and they regained consciousness after a few seconds. Sheldon, listen to me. It's not a wise choice to enter the precious metals market now. Dawson, my son's full moon party is the day after tomorrow. You must come. Ms. Cartier, you are still as beautiful as you were in your 20s. The hall soon became lively again. Everyone was socializing and greeting each other just like before Dracula appeared. It seems that they really don't remember anything about being hypnotized by Dracula just now. Not only that, the hall was clearly marked by Rorschach's heat rays and Dracula's lightning, but everyone seemed to have seen nothing at all. No one questioned this. It seems that Dracula's hypnosis is definitely not just simple hypnosis, but also modifies people's memory or consciousness to a certain extent. Or in other words, although everyone at this moment has woke up from their sleep, they are still in a hypnotic state. It can only be said that it is worthy of Dracula. In one word, awesome. As for monitoring, well, the world's first electronic surveillance system was invented in 1957, just 5 years ago. Even the world's first surveillance system that can record video will not be invented until 6 years later. In other words, there are basically no cameras now. As long as Dracula can deal with the human factor, everything will be fine. Since no one remembers what happened, Rorschach has nothing to worry about. He entered the system immediately. Just now, he harvested nearly 300 origin points. Host: Rorschach. Age: 16 years old. Speed: 134.1 meters per second. Strength: 95.2 tons. Physique: 274. Average value of healthy adult males, 10. Mental strength: 232. Average value of healthy adult males, 10. Current template: Homelander unlocking progress, 12%. Abilities: Perspective elementary, Superhearing elementary, Heat ray elementary, Flight unlocked. Source points: 326 points. Having just harvested 276 source points, plus the 50 source points that were not enough for the minimum settlement unit before, Rorschach now has more than 300 source points. In other words, Rorschach can now unlock and strengthen by 3% again. The host has surplus source points. Do you want to use them immediately for strengthening? At this time, the system prompt sounded again in my mind. Strengthen. What is there to hesitate about? Congratulations to the host, the Homelander template is unlocked by 15%. The system immediately sent such a prompt sound, which sounded so wonderful to Rorschach. At the same time, the data on Rorschach's panel also changed accordingly. Host: Rorschach. Age: 16 years old. Speed: 164.4 meters per second. Strength: 127.2 tons. Physique: 308. Average value of healthy adult men, 10. Mental strength: 271. Average value of healthy adult men, 10. Current template: Homelander unlock progress 15%. Abilities: Perspective elementary, Superhearing elementary, Heat ray elementary, Flight unlocked. Origin point: 26 points. Rorschach checked the data on the panel and found that his speed had reached half the speed of sound, his strength had reached more than 120 tons, and his physique and mental strength had also been improved accordingly. Although the data was not too obvious, Rorschach could clearly feel that his strength had actually increased a lot. Not bad. Rorschach was still very satisfied with this. At the beginning, he could never have imagined that accompanying Howard Stark to the trade fair would bring him such an unexpected gain. The key is that he not only got the origin point, but he also successfully got a group of vampires for free. It's a double harvest. Rorschach's mood is understandably very good. As for the vampire tribe that Dracula mentioned, Rorschach briefly thought about it and was still inclined to take over. After all, having some forces at his disposal is a good thing anyway. Rorschach. While he was thinking in his mind, Howard Stark's voice rang in his ears, and the playboy finally remembered Rorschach. Mr. Stark, how was the conversation with those ladies? Did you make an appointment with them? Rorschach looked at Howard Stark with a hint of teasing on his face. Rorschach, you misunderstood. In fact, those ladies came to me on their own initiative. Howard Stark looked coquettish. I'm not bragging, but I've always been popular with women. Rorschach really couldn't find any reason to object. To be honest, Howard Stark's appearance is not bad, and with his background, it is impossible for him not to be favored by women. Such a high-quality man is a hot commodity wherever he goes. Okay, Rorschach, General Ross is here, let's go to the parking lot. Howard Stark didn't continue to talk nonsense with Rorschach, but greeted Rorschach. General Ross is here. Did he bring his son with him? Rorschach asked a little curiously. Why would he bring a child here for an occasion like this? Rorschach, you seem to be very interested in General Ross's son. Howard Stark looked at Rorschach in surprise. That's a real pity. Rorschach couldn't help but feel a little regretful. He also wanted to see what Hulk and his father-in-law were like when they were children. Nothing, just ask. Rorschach waved his hand and changed the subject lightly. Mr. Stark, let's go. Although he was still a little curious, on this occasion, business was serious, so Howard Stark didn't say much. He nodded and left with Rorschach. The two quickly arrived at the parking lot and successfully found the target vehicle, a low-key and domineering Jeep. This is the car. My people detected the same energy radiation as UB6 in this car. Howard Stark pointed at the Jeep and said to Rorschach, so Rorschach, it's your turn now. Please use your ability to feel it again. Rorschach nodded and walked directly to the green Jeep without saying any nonsense. A line of prompts popped up immediately. Special energy source detected. Energy source analysis in progress. Energy value. 56 source points. Status, cannot be extracted. At the same time as the prompt sounded, the familiar scanning field of view also appeared, marking the Jeep. How about Rorschach? Seeing that Rorschach seemed to have finished, perceiving, Howard Stark on the side immediately asked. That's right, Rorschach said to Howard Stark in a very sure tone. Chapter 71. Rorschach, are you sure? Howard Stark's face immediately showed a look of excitement, and he stared at Rorschach for confirmation. Yes, I confirm. Rorschach nodded heavily. Yes. Howard Stark shook his fist excitedly. Ever since Rorschach discovered the first mechanical life form, S.H.I.E.L.D. has spent too many resources on it. Now, finally, we have achieved substantial gains. Mr. Stark, I don't know if it's too late to ask, but how much do you know about UB6's strength? Rorschach saw Howard Stark's excitement and couldn't help but ask him. The last time he handed it over to S.H.I.E.L.D. was the body of a Decepticon, and Rorschach had already confirmed in the hotel that S.H.I.E.L.D. had never found a Decepticon so far. Which means S.H.I.E.L.D. has never seen a living Decepticon. Therefore, Rorschach is still very skeptical about this. Rorschach, do you underestimate us too? Howard Stark was a little dissatisfied. The research on UB6 was led by Arnhem, and we have achieved very good results. Oh, Arnhem, it was you who almost destroyed the entire camp when you went to the bureau last time. The one that blew up. He is the chief researcher of our bureau, the most talented scientist after me. Arnhem, isn't it Arnhem Zola? Of course I know him. Rorschach was really speechless when he heard that Howard Stark spoke highly of Arnhem Zola. He was a die-hard loyalist to Hydra. He was truly loyal in life and filial in death. It was very touching. Mr. Stark, you seem to trust that Arnhem very much. Rorschach raised his eyebrows and looked at Howard Stark with interest. Of course, but Rorschach, you seem to have a point in your words. Howard Stark was not stupid, so he naturally heard what Rorschach meant. According to my observation, that Arnhem is rebellious. Rorschach acted inscrutable in front of Howard Stark. Anti-bone. Howard Stark frowned. He didn't understand what he meant. It's just a facial appearance that shows that this person is easy to betray. Rorschach explained again. Haha, Rorschach, of course Arnhem is not as handsome as me, but you can't judge a book by its appearance like that. Man, I know you are good for me, but you think too much. Howard Stark smiled disapprovingly. Naturally, it was impossible for him to believe Rorschach's ridiculous words. Rorschach didn't say much. He just remembered and mentioned it casually, and Howard Stark would believe it. If he didn't believe it, he wouldn't say anything more. Okay Rorschach, now that UB6 has been confirmed, I think it's time to talk to General Ross. Howard Stark's voice sounded. He patted Rorschach on the shoulder and planned to return to the hall. Stark, but at this time, a voice sounded. But in the aisle not far ahead, a tall, dignified middle-aged man was looking at Howard Stark with a frown. Next to the majestic middle-aged man, there was another young man in a suit, who seemed to be a bodyguard and follower. Rorschach glanced at the other party and found that the other party's eyebrows vaguely looked like General Ross, or Secretary Ross, and he came to a natural conclusion in his mind. This person is probably General Ross, right? Sorry Stark, but what are you doing in front of my car? Are you investigating me? General Ross's slightly unhappy voice continued to sound, and he strode directly towards Howard Stark. General Ross, please don't get me wrong, I can explain. I can explain everything. Howard Stark felt a little bit pained in his balls and immediately said sternly to General Ross. You'd better give me a convincing explanation. General Ross snorted softly without being angry. The person who touched my car last time was also one of yours, right? Are you suspecting that there is something hidden in my car? What? General Ross, this is a misunderstanding, a complete misunderstanding. Can you take a step to speak? Howard Stark asked the other party very politely. General Ross pondered for 3 seconds and said expressionlessly, "You have 3 minutes." That's enough. General Ross, please. Howard Stark made a gesture of invitation, took 2 steps with General Ross, and slightly reached a quiet place. Then he told General Ross everything about the Decepticons in a low voice. This kind of thing is simply a fantasy to those who don't know about it. As expected, General Ross was immediately angry. Absurd. Absolutely ridiculous. You actually told me that my car is a living thing. You're telling me my car can turn into a giant robot. He rushed to his Jeep in 2 steps, pointed at his Jeep, and ruthlessly Howard Stark issued his own accusation. Stark, you are still a scientist, but listen to what you are saying. Even my 13-year-old son can't say such ridiculous things. Hush, General Ross, please stop talking, it might hear. Howard Stark shouted at General Ross in a hurry. According to Rorschach's intelligence, mechanical life forms are intelligent life forms and can understand human language. All the previous exchanges between him and Rorschach were code names, not words like mechanical life forms. Really, it can hear. That's great, man, if you can hear, please transform and see. General Ross almost sneered. Crack, crack, but at this moment, the heavy metal friction sound suddenly sounded. The Jeep that was lying on the ground suddenly began to split and reassemble crazily. The various parts of its body were surging like waves, which was dazzling. In just a blink of an eye, the ordinary Jeep had disappeared. A huge robot that looked 6 or 7 meters high appeared in front of everyone. God, Jesus Christ, General Ross, who had previously denounced Howard Stark, was stunned as if he had seen a ghost. He just raised his head and murmured at the behemoth in front of him, shocked and speechless. Not to mention him, even Howard Stark, who had seen the corpse of the Decepticon long ago, was dumbfounded. After all, he had never seen the transformation of the Decepticon before, and this visual shock was an instinctive reaction. Even Howard Stark couldn't keep calm. God, how could this happen? General Ross's shocking voice sounded again. He looked up at the huge robot in front of him and felt that his 3 views were all shattered. I told you that, General Ross. Howard Stark couldn't help but whispered beside General Ross. Yes, Stark, you were right, but what should we do now? General Ross spread his hands, looking helpless and anxious. Facing such a huge guy, the weapon in his hand is simply a joke. It has no effect at all. General Ross even doubted that even if he really summoned an army, it might not be useful unless it was equipped with some heavy firepower. General Ross, don't be nervous, things are not as bad as you think. Howard Stark looked much calmer. He said to General Ross in a confident tone. General Ross was slightly stunned, and then he was surprised. Where did Howard Stark get the confidence? However, General Ross had no time to ask in detail at this time, because the huge robot in front of him had already spoken. But he saw that the other party held up his huge head and stared at Howard Stark. You actually recognized me. Yes, I recognized you. You are not the first mechanical life form I have seen. Howard Stark quickly regained his composure, and his face was still shining with excitement, the kind of enthusiasm that only belongs to scientists. What are you? Why did you come to Earth? I found you around me and General Ross, what is your purpose? Howard Stark stared at the Decepticon in front of him, and asked the questions he had always wanted to figure out. You, a low-level creature, actually spoke to me in this tone. The Decepticon sneered and angrily hammered the ground with his huge fist. Bang! With a loud noise, General Ross and Howard Stark both clearly felt that the ground under their feet was shaking. Cold sweat broke out on their foreheads. The physical and mental shock and the unspeakable oppression felt in front of such a huge monster cannot be experienced without being there in person. Howard Stark's anus suddenly tightened and he subconsciously withered. He instinctively shrank in front of a car on the side and did not dare to show his head. General Ross and his bodyguard did the same. The two quickly shrank beside the car to cover and took out a pistol at the first time. But even if they held the big killer in their hands, they could not give them any confidence. Only Rorschach was not in a hurry and still stood there calmly. It formed a very obvious contrast with the other few people who were panicked like rats crossing the street. The Decepticon's eyes were naturally attracted by Rorschach. At this time, the Decepticon also recalled some things that happened before. It's you. The person who really recognized me is actually you. The other guy finally confirmed his identity by confirming with the young man. The real key is not the other person, but this young man. Mr. Stark, General Ross, you stay away. Rorschach did not pay attention to this Decepticon, but waved to Howard Stark and General Ross on the side. Stark, is he your man? What is he doing? General Ross was confused and whispered to Howard Stark. Is that young man looking for death? General Ross, Don't ask so many questions, just listen to him. Let's get out of the way quickly. Howard Stark did not have time to explain too much to General Ross, but shouted to General Ross in a very affirmative tone. Although General Ross was also surprised why Howard Stark blindly believed in the young man, and even more surprised why the young man asked them to stay away, his reason still made him temporarily obey Howard Stark's words. Several people quickly crouched and retreated to a distance like rats crossing the street. General Ross had time to ask Howard Stark beside him, "Stark, what are we doing? What is he doing? Why did he ask us to stay away? Maybe, he thinks we are in the way." Howard Stark tilted his head and thought for a while, then said to General Ross seriously. "General Ross." Boom boom boom. Just when General Ross and Howard Stark were whispering, the ground began to tremble again. But while they were transferring, the Decepticon was not idle and had a friendly conversation with Rorschach. As a result, he was angered by Rorschach in a few moves and began to attack Rorschach in anger. But he rushed to Rorschach in a few moves, swung his fist bigger than Rorschach's head, and hammered at Rorschach fiercely. General Ross's heart couldn't help but beat hard. It's over, that kid will definitely be smashed into meat paste. Dang. But the next moment, the sound of metal collision was heard, and the Decepticon's huge fist was frozen in the air. It could not fall down no matter what. Because there was another fist under the Decepticon's fist. Rorschach's fist. Rorschach just casually raised his right fist and blocked it upwards, and he blocked the Decepticon's huge fist like Mount high. It was only a tiny fist of a few centimeters, but it was like a mountain, making it impossible for the Decepticon to hit it. It was as if Bai Yuikui easily blocked the furious Captain Mark with a wave of his hand. The scene was too shocking. Gulp. General Ross couldn't help swallowing hard, his face was full of shock, and he couldn't believe his eyes at all. How could such a thing be possible? Is this something that humans can do? Rorschach, this is too exaggerated, right? Even Howard Stark, who had known Rorschach's true identity for a long time, was stunned. He did know that Rorschach was powerful and could kill the Decepticons, but Howard Stark was still surprised that he could do it so easily. Bang! At this time, a loud noise was heard again. It was Rorschach who blocked the Decepticon's fist and then exerted force. Boom boom boom. The Decepticon staggered as if struck by lightning, and then began to retreat backwards continuously. Whoosh! Bang! Rorschach was relentless and jumped and punched the Decepticon. The Decepticon's huge body flew out directly. Boom! With this loud bang, everyone felt that the ground was shaking violently, and the Decepticon fell heavily to the ground. That scene was so shocking, especially for General Ross. However, before the Decepticon could get up, everyone felt a flash in front of their eyes. It was Rorschach who jumped several meters away and jumped on the Decepticon. Boom! His fist hit the Decepticon's chest hard. It immediately smashed a big hole into the Decepticon's chest. For a while, electric sparks flashed non-stop, and broken metal fragments flew everywhere. Even the Decepticon's fire was exposed by Rorschach's hammer. If Rorschach completely destroyed its fire, the Decepticon would be completely dead, and even the gods could not save it. But Rorschach did not do so. He had to keep this Decepticon alive. Ahem! A loud coughing sound was heard, and the Decepticon was almost beaten to death by Rorschach with one punch. Even though he was a mechanical life form, he could not withstand Rorschach's huge punch of hundreds of tons. This was the result of Rorschach's slow play, otherwise this punch would have sent the Decepticon to see his grandmother. That's right, Rorschach's current strength is so strong in front of ordinary Decepticons, it is completely crushing. Even without heat rays, physical strength alone is crushing. Get out of my way. The weak roar of the Decepticon sounded in my ears. It was the Decepticon who gathered all his strength and punched Rorschach fiercely. But Rorschach easily grabbed his arm with one hand, and then Rorschach used the other hand and exerted force suddenly. Bang! The Decepticon's arm was actually pulled off by Rorschach. General Ross and Howard Stark on the side were both trembling with heartbeats, and were almost turned into fools by the stimulation. Compared to that robot, he is a monster, right? General Ross looked at Rorschach's cool and domineering demeanor, and murmured almost like a raving. Who said it wasn't? Howard Stark sighed with deep approval. Bang! There was a loud noise, and Rorschach violently tore off the other arm of the Decepticon. Then he kicked the Decepticon aside casually, like kicking garbage. After Rorschach's thunderous blows, the Decepticon had completely turned into a pile of scrap metal. The two arms carrying the weapon system were also torn off by Rorschach, and basically posed no threat to everyone. Okay, done. Rorschach clapped his hands and said to Howard Stark casually, as if he had done something insignificant. Rorschach, you didn't kill him, did you? Howard Stark ran out from behind the bunker, looked at the motionless Decepticon with a little worry, and then looked at Rorschach and asked. No, he's still alive. Rorschach said indifferently. Huh. Howard Stark couldn't help but let out a long sigh of relief after hearing this. They finally found another Decepticon. If it was killed by Rorschach, it would be a waste of time. A dead Decepticon is not worthless to them, but the value is not that great. After all, when the last bit of energy in the Decepticon's body dissipated, that thing was just a pile of rare metals from outer space, nothing more. Stark, so all this is true. General Ross's surprised voice sounded, and he walked to Howard Stark's side with an incredible look on his face. He looked at the remains of the Decepticon from left to right, front to back. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed it. Such a big guy turned out to be his car. So all the ridiculous things Howard Stark said to him about mechanical lifeforms were true. Yes, General Ross, as you can see, this is all true. Howard Stark nodded heavily in agreement. At this time, General Ross's eyes were taken back from the Decepticons and naturally fell on Rorschach. His face became more and more restless. This guy with an oriental face was even more unbelievable than his car that turned into a huge mechanical lifeform. Stark, who is he? General Ross lowered his voice, put his head in front of Howard Stark, and asked in a low voice. General Ross, this question is a bit complicated, and it can't be explained in 1 or 2 sentences. Howard Stark spread his hands. Well, Stark, I think there are a lot of things we need to talk about. General Ross looked at Howard Stark meaningfully and said. Both his car and Rorschach were far beyond General Ross's usual cognition, making him feel that he had lived a dog's life for so many years. General Ross was eager to figure out everything. Of course, General Ross, if you are willing, I am welcome at any time. Howard Stark agreed. Since General Ross has seen this, it is impossible for S.H.I.E.L.D. to continue the secret research. In this case, it is better to agree to it openly. Oh my God, what is going on? Hiss, what is that big guy? Alien, there is an alien here. ... Although the battle between Rorschach and the Decepticons was not long, it can even be said that it can be completely summarized by the word, quick. But there is no way, the movement is still too loud, and many people in the villa are still alarmed. People came over after hearing the news, and then saw the jaw-dropping scene. It made the two of them feel overwhelmed. What they least want is that this kind of thing is exposed, especially in such a celebrity gathering. If it is ordinary people, there is naturally no problem, they can just fool around. But these people at the scene are all well known, so it is not easy to fool them. It hurts. Mr. Stark, since the matter has been resolved, I will go back first. Seeing that the scene was already a bit chaotic, there was no point in staying any longer, so Rorschach said nothing and came to Howard Stark to say goodbye to him. Howard Stark was so busy now that he had no time to take care of Rorschach. He thanked Rorschach and apologized, and then saw Rorschach leave alone. Back at Xavier Manor, the atmosphere was as warm as ever. The mutants are each undergoing corresponding training. In a corridor not far ahead, Rorschach saw Charles and Eric standing together from a distance. Eric just stretched out his hand and kept making gestures in the air in front of him. What are you doing? Rorschach walked over casually and looked at Eric curiously. Rorschach, you're back. Charles smiled and greeted Rorschach. The two of us were chatting just now. Although after this period of training, especially under your prompt, everyone has made great progress, but with you, there is still a certain gap. Actually, I've always been curious, how do you do it? Why can you control your abilities so perfectly? I think this is my unique talent. Rorschach also smiled at Charles. Rorschach, Charles is crazy. Eric also stopped at this time, pointed forward, and said to Rorschach, he actually asked me to move that big guy. Rorschach looked in the direction Eric pointed, and saw a huge signal receiver several kilometers away, like a large pot lid turned upside down. The diameter seems to be nearly 100 meters no matter what. This signal receiver is naturally insignificant compared to the football fields and Golden Gate bridges that Magneto moved in the future, but for Eric now, it is very exaggerated. He had never tried to move something so huge, still so far apart. Even during this period of training, Eric has made some progress, but this kind of monster is still a bit exaggerated for him. No, Eric, with your potential you can definitely do it, I have no doubt about it. Charles said to Eric with a serious face. Come on, Charles, I'm not a young man like the siren. Your chicken blood is useless to me. Eric shook his head with disapproval. Eric, Charles is right. Rorschach also spoke at this time, with the same serious look on his face. I even believe that your potential is far more than this. If you really exert your power, moving that thing will be trivial to you. You can even move the Golden Gate Bridge. Golden Gate Bridge, Rorschach, you are exaggerating. Eric laughed, thinking Rorschach was joking with him. Charles, you know telepathy, tell Eric, am I kidding? Rorschach glanced at Charles beside him. Charles couldn't help but rolled his eyes. You know that my ability will not work on you. But Eric, you destroyed a cruise ship at that time, you should believe in your potential. That was different, I was in a state of extreme anger. Then put your anger to good use. Seeing that Charles did not seem to be joking with him, Eric said nothing more. He took a deep breath and continued to experiment with the huge signal receiver from a distance. However, the receiver didn't respond at all. I cannot do it. Eric shook his head a little dejectedly. This kind of thing was still too forced for him. Eric, when I say use your anger, I don't mean to let the anger control you, but you control the anger. I think the key should be some balance between anger and calm. Do you mind if I? Having said this, Charles raised his hand and asked Eric for his opinion. Eric shook his head without any hesitation. Now, although he has some differences with Charles on some concepts about mutants, privately, the two are really close friends who trust each other. Eric has a troubled past, but he doesn't mind Charles knowing about it. Charles put his hand on his temple and activated his ability on Eric. Eric was in a daze, feeling that some memories that he had completely forgotten appeared in his mind. A memory that he had forgotten but was very warm. The long-lost warmth. Eric shed tears unconsciously. Charles, what did you just do? Eric looked at Charles with a little excitement and asked, what did you do to me just now? I entered the most shining place in your memory system. It's such a beautiful memory. Thank you, Eric. Charles shrugged. I don't know that I still remember those. Eric smiled. There are still many memories that you are not aware of. Eric, there is not only pain and anger in your heart, but also many beautiful things. I feel it. When you remember everything, you will be invincible. Let's try again. Under the guidance of Charles, Eric quickly adjusted his mentality. He turned around and stretched out his hand to the signal receiver again. In this moment, Eric's state is different from before. He felt the signal receiver and used his ability to catch the opponent from a distance. Drink. Eric let out such a low roar, exerting all his strength, and his body trembled slightly. And finally, the huge signal receiver a few kilometers away actually started to rotate. Eric was surprised and happy. He himself couldn't believe that he could do such a thing. Ha ha ha. Eric couldn't help but laugh out loud in excitement. Rorschach immediately looked over without blinking, and couldn't help but laugh. Fassbender was born. Eric's smile just now really resembled that shark. Famous scene. Rorschach really regretted not taking a camera to take a picture of the scene just now. Ha ha ha, Charles, Rorschach, I did it. I did it. Eric shouted to the two with great joy. Eric, I told you a long time ago that you can do it. Rorschach said as a matter of course. The strength of Lao Wan in the future is very terrifying. How can this be the beginning? Well done, Eric. Charles was also happy for his old friend from the bottom of his heart. The president's speech is about to begin. A familiar voice suddenly sounded, and Mora poked his head out of a window on the upper floor next to him and shouted to the few people. When Rorschach left, Mora had already gone out to investigate Xiao's intelligence. Now that he came back so early, it seemed that he had indeed found nothing as Rorschach expected. But it must be said that Mora came back at the right time. Eric, Rorschach, let's go. When they heard that the president's speech was about to begin, several people immediately cheered up. Charles greeted his two friends directly and quickly returned to the house. During this period of time, the situation between the United States and the Soviet Union has reached an extreme point, which can even be said to be freezing point. It was even said that a big war broke out directly next, and no one found it strange. The future destiny of this country is in an uncertain situation. Everyone is waiting for the country to give them an answer. Therefore, it can be said that this presidential speech is of national concern, and these mutants are no exception. Especially when everyone knew that Xiao was behind the situation and they failed to stop it. Not only Charles and Eric, but Mora also notified the other mutants in training at the same time. Everyone paid close attention to this matter and immediately gathered in the living room. I hope this speech can bring us some good news. The siren stood behind the sofa, folding his arms, staring at the TV set on the stool in front of him, and praying weakly. Man, I don't know why, I always have a bad feeling. The ravaged person uttered such a sentence leisurely. Why do you think so? Darwin couldn't help but glance at the ravager. Because this world is full of bad things and nothing good ever happens. The ravager said matter-of-factly, isn't everything we've experienced been like this? Alex, at this time, it won't help if you say dejected words. Raven said to the ravager a little helplessly. Hush, be quiet, it's starting. Mora shouted from the side, interrupting everyone. Everyone cheered up, closed their mouths, and focused their attention on the small TV in front of them. From a national policy perspective, any act that crosses the embargo line on Cuba will be regarded as an attack by the Big Bear country against the beautiful country. In this regard, the beautiful country will definitely fight back with all its strength and show no mercy. On the screen, a guy who would become famous on the internet with his smile in the future was giving a serious speech. This made the atmosphere in the hall suddenly become dull. The situation seems to be heading towards the step that everyone least wants to see. Although everyone had expected this for a long time, when everyone confirmed this in person, few people were able to remain calm. I knew it had always been like this. The ravager said in an old-fashioned tone. Xiao must be there, Eric said in a very affirmative tone. How do you know? The destroyer looked at Eric a little strangely. Two superpowers are facing off there, and Xiao wants to start World War III. He won't miss this opportunity. Charles answered on Eric's behalf. His brows could be said to be deeply wrinkled, like an old chrysanthemum blooming in late autumn. Charles was more unwilling to see this kind of thing than others. Let's stop the diplomatic talk, we have to prepare for tomorrow's action. Eric spoke again, his face resolute and full of ruthlessness. After saying these decisive words, he turned around and walked out. Get ready, Eric, what do you mean? Siren was a little confused and didn't react for a while. He asked Eric in a loud voice from behind. Sean, why have we been training for so long? Hank adjusted his glasses, and there was determination on his handsome face. We have to stop him. That means, tomorrow, we are going to Cuba. Siren's eyes widened. Naturally, he had already made preparations to deal with Xiao, but the fact that he was suddenly going to a foreign country without any warning caught the Siren off guard. Yeah, we're going to Cuba, Charles said seriously at this time. He glanced at the mutants in the room. This is our only chance. Everyone felt a heavy burden being placed on their shoulders. They fought against the Black Emperor twice, but each time they were defeated miserably. Needless to say, the first time, almost everyone except Rorschach was scared to death by the Black Emperor, but what about the second time? The Black Emperor people didn't even show up, so they almost got them all in one fell swoop. With these two shadows, everyone is actually quite stressed about the upcoming third confrontation with the Black Emperor. Although everyone's strength has made a qualitative leap. Don't be nervous, everyone. What do you have to worry about? Seeing that everyone at the scene was not too confident, Charles smiled and pointed to Rorschach on the side. We have Rorschach here. That's right, Rorschach. The somewhat sluggish morale of the crowd was slightly boosted. Their two battles with the Black Emperor were complete defeats, but there was one exception. In both fights, Rorschach hit the Black Emperor hard in the face. Especially in the second time, Rorschach single-handedly defeated the Black Emperor's conspiracy. It can be said that Rorschach is their source of confidence. Yes, with Rorschach here, what are we afraid of? Raven said with a smile. She had inexplicable confidence in Rorschach. I can assure you that Xiao will lose this time. Facing the eyes of the crowd, Rorschach said in a tone of affirmation that was almost decisive. This was not Rorschach showing off or anything. After all, he knew the plot in advance. Xiao would die tragically at the hands of Eric in the end. But, Rorschach then thought again, the war between mutants and Xiao had changed a lot because of his rebirth. Apart from anything else, the people who participated in the war on Xiao's side, the Rapids and the Red Devils, had been killed by Rorschach a long time ago, and the Angels did not betray. So this time everyone has to face a brand new, Black Emperor camp. But even so, Rorschach has enough confidence. The reason is that Rorschach is really strong now. It is not an exaggeration to say that there is no rival among mutants. Of course, mutants at this stage. Except for the Black Emperor, who Rorschach could not kill, Rorschach believed that he could easily kill any mutant sent by Xiao. And the Black Emperor, Rorschach also knew his fatal weakness. As long as the opponent's helmet was taken off, the Black Emperor would be a younger brother. There was really nothing to worry about. You heard it, Rorschach said so. Charles spread his hands to the young mutants. Sure enough, after getting Rorschach's personal guarantee, everyone's spirit was immediately greatly improved. The low morale was greatly encouraged. Okay, everyone, disperse and do what you need to do. We have been preparing to fight Xiao, and we are all ready. This is not a big deal, right? Charles's voice sounded again. Seeing that everyone was in good shape, he clapped his hands and said to everyone. Too much encouragement will bring unnecessary tension to everyone. The best way is to dilute it. So Charles did not give a long speech to everyone, but used a relaxed way to unload the burden in everyone's heart. But Charles, what should we do? The siren touched his head and looked at Charles a little blankly. Tomorrow is an epic-making battle, but he really doesn't know what to prepare. Everything is fine as usual. Charles smiled at the siren. Let's go, Sean, the game between the two of us hasn't been decided yet. The Ravager patted the siren's shoulder and smiled at him. Just before they were called by Mora, they were having a friendly battle. The two of them, one using sound waves and the other using energy waves, have similar attack methods, so they often train together. Let's go. Continue training. The other mutants also left Charles's room. Rorschach, it looks like we'll have to rely on you again tomorrow. Raven walked beside Rorschach naturally and smiled at him. No, tomorrow it's up to all of us. Rorschach said to Raven seriously. With his current abilities, it's still very difficult to kill Xiao, and Rorschach still has this self-awareness. To kill Xiao, Charles's assistance is absolutely indispensable. And before that, Xiao has been hiding in a nuclear submarine under the sea. To find that nuclear submarine, you need the siren's sound wave positioning. To get the nuclear submarine out of the water, you need Eric's magnetic field control. This is really a team battle, not individual heroism. Do you really think that we will definitely defeat Xiao and stop him this time? Raven did not continue the previous topic, but looked into Rorschach's eyes and asked again. Of course, I have this confidence, Rorschach said without thinking. Looking at Rorschach's angular face, Raven felt unprecedented peace of mind. I'm beginning to believe this, Rorschach. Raven's face suddenly relaxed, and she smiled at Rorschach. Perhaps because they had fought with Xiao twice, everyone had a certain experience, so their psychological tolerance had to be improved a lot. Perhaps Rorschach really brought everyone confidence, or maybe it was both factors. In short, after coming out of Charles's room, everyone's state was pretty good. Even like the guy who was ravaged, some were eager to try. The mutants returned to their posts, one after another, and each of them carried out the training that was interrupted by the president's speech before. Rorschach was the same. He had just unlocked 3% of the progress, and his physical fitness in all aspects had been enhanced to a certain extent, and he also needed to adapt. Rorschach shrugged his shoulders after accidentally catching a glimpse of the ring on his hand. Taking over the undead tribe had to be postponed. Rorschach. Eric's voice sounded behind him just after he arrived at his exclusive training ground, and had not had time to enter. What's wrong, Eric? Rorschach turned his head to look at Eric and found that the other party seemed to be hesitant to speak, so he couldn't help asking. Let's train together. Eric didn't say much, but just waved at Rorschach. The two had joint training many times before, so Rorschach didn't say much, turned around and followed Eric to another outdoor training ground. There were many metal objects there, which could be used to train Eric's magnetic control and Rorschach's heat rays at the same time. The two had trained like this many times before, the kind of training other than actual combat. So when he arrived at the training ground this time, Eric didn't say anything nonsense, and very skillfully controlled the objects to shoot at Rorschach. Chi chi chi. Rorschach's pupils also began to flash outward with blazing heat rays. Whoosh whoosh whoosh. Chi chi chi. For a moment, the training ground was full of lasers and flying objects, which was very lively. Rorschach. It was not until the two of them sat on the ground with sweat on their bodies to rest that Eric spoke to Rorschach with a serious face. You know, I will definitely kill Xiao tomorrow. Eric said to Rorschach, but Charles will definitely stop me, he will definitely. Yes, Charles will definitely stop me. Rorschach nodded. Having watched the movie, he was even more convinced of this. I cherish Charles as a friend very much. He is not only my friend, but also my brother. I want to protect us mutants together with him, but man, Charles will never agree with my ideas. So, Eric, what do you want to say? Rorschach, I don't know what will happen tomorrow, but I always have a bad feeling that things will not be solved perfectly and not as we all want. But you have always known that I have always wanted to do something for our fellow mutants, so that our fellow mutants can live freely in this world without having to hide or cower. So Rorschach, if I need your help, will you help me? Eric used a somewhat obscure tone to hint something to Rorschach, and at the same time he was also wooing Rorschach. Rorschach knew it well. Presumably Eric had already decided to part ways with Charles after the battle with Xiao, right? Even if there hadn't been the accident where he injured Charles later, Eric would probably have left. But Rorschach didn't plan to leave with Eric. Eric, I will do it. Whether you or Charles, I will do it. We are all brothers, aren't we? Rorschach smiled at Eric. Yes, we are all brothers. Eric murmured and repeated this sentence. He did agree with this. Even if Charles would prevent him from killing Xiao, Charles was still his brother. It's just that she doesn't understand him as well as Rorschach. Eric, don't think so much. No matter what, things will be solved eventually. Rorschach stood up, patted the dust on his butt, and said to Eric. Let's continue training. Yes, everything will be solved in the end. Eric nodded. The two began to devote themselves to training again. Night falls quietly. A full moon hangs high in the sky. If it were normal, the living room would definitely be very lively at this time. Many young mutants would chat and play here after dinner. But now, the living room is quiet. After all, the decisive battle is coming soon. After another day of training, everyone is very tired. It is time to recharge their batteries. Hank did not rest, he just sat at the desk, looking at the syringe of medicine in his hand, a little absent-minded. Through studying the blood samples Rorschach brought him last time, Hank discovered that the previous medicine had some fatal flaws. Not only will that not curb the X gene in your body, but it will greatly enhance it. If that's the case, not only will Hank be unable to cure his big, animal-like feet, but he will also develop animalistic characteristics in other parts of his body. Hank couldn't help but feel scared when he thought about it. But now, the potion is truly perfect and has no flaws anymore. The only regret is that Hank excitedly wanted to share this potion with Raven to cure her blue skin, but was ruthlessly rejected by Raven. This made Hank a little disappointed. But it also made him more determined to inject the medicine. After a while, Hank took a long breath, calmed down his mood, and then, with a touch of nervousness and excitement, injected the syringe into his body. Then Hank stared at his unusually big feet without blinking, not daring to take a big breath. Soon, Hank's big foot muscles began to surge, and after a period of deformation that outsiders could not imagine, they returned to normal. Ha ha, Hank laughed out loud with joy. Success. He finally succeeded. At this moment, Hank really wanted to share the good news with Rorschach. Early the next morning, the mutants got up early. Instead of training as usual, everyone gathered together at the first moment. Everyone's expressions were very solemn, because what everyone has to do next is so important that it will even change the structure of the future world. Even though they were given a beating by Charles yesterday, everyone still felt a sense of pressure as the departure was approaching. Everyone, we have been preparing for so long and training so hard for so long just for this moment. To stop Xiao. To stop Xiao from destroying the world, to save the world. Yes, we are going to save the world. We'll make it. I firmly believe this. We will succeed. Facing everyone's gaze, Charles gave everyone another shot of chicken blood. Okay, let's start. Eric was relatively simple. He clapped his hands directly and said to everyone. Wait a moment. Hank stood up at this time. He adjusted his glasses and said to everyone, I have prepared some things for you. I think you might be able to use them. Hank is a top scientist. Although the abilities of mutants are not very strong, his scientific research is really powerful. Seeing Hank's mysterious appearance, everyone was really curious about what good things Hank had prepared for everyone. But when Hank opened a big box that had been prepared for a long time, everyone couldn't help but cover their faces. It turns out that Hank prepared a set of uniforms for everyone, and they were very ugly. Hank, you've been busy. Eric couldn't help but tease. Seriously, do we really have to wear this thing? Siren looked embarrassed. Considering that we can neither withstand extreme gravity nor be bulletproof, I suggest that it is better for everyone to wear them. Hank smiled at everyone. Well, Raven shrugged on the side, I believe these are not problems for Rorschach. Even a mutant mercenary couldn't penetrate Rorschach's abnormal body with a knife. It's natural to be bulletproof, right? Well, except Rorschach, Hank added on the side. But despite this, Rorschach did not refuse. Instead, he put on the first-generation uniform of the X-Men together with everyone. This is the first uniform from the first battle of the X-Men, and it is very commemorative. Although Rorschach actually thinks this uniform is a bit ugly. But it doesn't matter. We are going to fight, not to go on a blind date. Look at us. We even have uniforms. Shouldn't we give our team another name? Raven's addiction to naming came back again, and she even made a suggestion. What do you think of X-Men? X-Men, a group of warriors with X genes. Not bad. Ruiwan, this is too vulgar. The mutants joked casually, but no one took this name to heart. No one could have imagined that this name that Ruiwan made up on a whim would become such an important team in the future. Is this how the X-Men were born? Luo Xia thought with great interest. He can be regarded as witnessing history. Okay, let's go. After the group was ready, Charles clapped his hands happily and led everyone to a huge warehouse. Inside, a fighter plane that looked extremely cool and surpassed the current era in every aspect appeared in front of everyone. The first-generation Blackbird fighter jet is very memorable. Luo Xia looked at the slightly rough fighter plane and couldn't help but thought to himself. Not to mention anything else, if he just took a photo, he believed that those ardent fans of the X-Men would definitely spend a lot of money to buy it. Charles, isn't this too exaggerated? You even have this thing, oh ho ho. The siren shouted excitedly, even his eyes widened. We have to have some form of transportation. Charles grinned and pretended to be a bit of a dick in front of everyone. Cool, very cool. Darwin was also a little surprised. I never dared to imagine that one day I would get on such a cool plane. But, who will fly the plane? Eric, Mora, the destroyer asked a key question. Of course it is me. The delicate and graceful Hank took a step forward. Sorry Hank, can you still fly a plane? The destroyer looked at Hank a little suspiciously. The old man's span was a bit big. Of course, I built this plane. Hank said calmly, pretending to be a medium-sized guy. Naturally, there was no nonsense next. Everyone got on the plane, found a place to sit, and fastened their seat belts. Attention everyone, we are about to take off. Hank greeted everyone and performed a series of corresponding operations. Aha! The plane shot directly into the sky and disappeared. Cuba. On the boundless sea, the two fleets are facing each other across the embargo line. The atmosphere can be described as tense and ready to explode. A cargo ship from the Great Bear Country, however, seemed to be provoking the United States, and kept heading towards the waters of the United States. Sir, there are still 3 minutes before they cross the embargo line. On the main ship of the United States, the deputy reported to the Supreme Commander in a deep voice. But in fact, the Supreme Commander had already seen this scene through the telescope, but the depressing atmosphere at the scene made him a little breathless, so that he could not easily make a heavy decision. Because that decision is likely to trigger the Third World War. But even so, some decisions must still be made. If they dare to cross the line, they will be on their own. The Supreme Commander murmured in a low voice, and then decisively gave the order, "Sound the battle alarm." Beep beep beep. The harsh alarm sounded throughout the fleet immediately, and the United States side instantly entered a combat state. When the fleet of the Great Bear Country saw the battle of the United States, it naturally took corresponding targeted measures. It also entered a state of combat readiness. The situation on the scene became more and more tense. At this moment, whether it was the United States or the Great Bear Country, everyone's attention was focused on the freighter that was constantly approaching the embargo line. The behavior of the freighter in the next 3 minutes will directly determine the future direction of the world. Everyone's heart was in their throat. Seeing that the freighter was getting closer and closer to the embargo line, the breathing of the people on the two fleets became heavy. Some people clenched their fists unconsciously. Fortunately, at that critical moment, the Great Bear Country received an order from the upper level. Order the freighter to stop moving forward and return directly. In other words, stop provoking the United States. All the people in the Great Bear Country fleet breathed a sigh of relief. This war that could have opened the curtain of the Third World War was finally stopped at a critical moment. RLC, please answer. RLC, please answer. RLC, I order you to return to Odessa immediately. However, things got a little out of control. The Great Bear Country issued a return order to the freighter one after another, but the other party ignored it completely. Still approaching the embargo line, the air in the entire sea area seemed to become heavy. Whoosh! But at this critical moment, a cool fighter suddenly appeared and whizzed past. What the hell? Where did this plane come from? Whether it was the United States or the Great Bear Country, the people on both fleets were stunned and confused. It was completely unclear how a fighter suddenly appeared. However, due to this extremely sensitive moment, any random firing by either fleet would lead to catastrophic consequences that could not be controlled. So despite being confused, the people on both fleets did not take any measures for the time being. They just stared at the fighter jet, showing off, right under their noses. There is no doubt that this fighter jet is the Blackbird fighter jet that the mutants are riding. Hank, this guy, has been firing on all cylinders all the way, and finally appeared at this critical moment. The mutants in the cabin witnessed the smoke-filled scene with their own eyes, and they couldn't help but be secretly shocked. It was like standing in front of an active volcano that has been brewing for a long time and is about to erupt. I don't know when it will erupt directly. The scene looks really messy. Hank couldn't help but sigh. What's the matter with that freighter? Does the Great Bear Country really want to provoke a dispute between the two countries? Raven couldn't help but frown deeply, like an old blue chrysanthemum blooming in late autumn. It seems that Xiao's behind-the-scenes provocation is still very successful. No, it shouldn't be the Great Bear Country's problem. Charles said so, and then he directly activated his mental ability and controlled the consciousness of a person in the Salt Sea freighter. By reading the man's spiritual consciousness, he understood everything. Sure enough, it was Xiao. Charles's face became very ugly. His people have been there and changed the route. He is the one who controls the ship to sail towards the embargo line. Once the ship crosses the embargo line, it will be bombed by us immediately, and the war will begin. Mora's face became unprecedentedly solemn. Charles, can't you control the people on the RLC to change direction? The Ravager couldn't help but make a suggestion. I can't do it, everyone on the RLC is dead. Charles shook his head. If he could control it, would he still wait for the Ravager to remind him? There was no living person on the RLC, and he was lucky just now to find a guy who was still alive in his last moments. This situation can't be used to make a fuss. American Independence ship, I'm Alexander Nowitzki, we have lost control of our freighter. We have ordered it to return, please don't fire. Please don't fire. A voice sounded in the sea at this time. It was the Bear Country who saw that the RLC had completely lost control, so they had to shout to the beautiful country. However, the beautiful country mistakenly thought that the Bear Country was cheating, and did not listen at all. Instead, it began to enter the countdown stage of firing. The situation is urgent. At this critical moment, Charles acted decisively and immediately used his ability to control an officer on the Bear Country fleet and fired a missile. The RLC freighter was blown up before it crossed the embargo line. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, whether it was the United States and the Soviet Union, or the mutants in the Blackbird fighter. Once the Aral Sea was blown up, the two fleets would no longer have a reason to go to war. World War III can be said to have been prevented. Then, the mutants can start to concentrate on dealing with Xiao. But what made the mutants a little frustrated was that Charles could not sense Xiao's existence. He must be down there, we must find a way to find him, Eric said in an unquestionable tone. Hank, Charles asked Hank, who was standing in front of the fighter plane. There is no discovery on the radar. Hank shook his head. He must be hiding underwater, but unfortunately we don't have sonar. Without sonar, how can we conduct underwater detection? No, Hank, who said we don't have sonar? Rorschach laughed at this time. That's right, who said we don't have it? The siren also laughed. How could the others not react at this time? Isn't the siren equivalent to a human-shaped sonar? As soon as they said it, the siren, Eric and Charles unfastened their seatbelts and walked to the side of the bottom hatch of the fighter. Hank, open the bottom hatch. The siren shouted to Hank, who was driving the fighter in front. Boom, boom, boom. The bottom hatch was opened directly, and the turbulent seawater appeared in the sight of several people. The biting wind poured in directly, making everyone a little breathless. Remember, this is just a muscle, you can control it. Charles shouted at the side of the siren, giving the siren psychological counseling. Just think so, we'll see you later. Listen to my orders. 3, 2, 1, go. Swoosh. The siren jumped out of the bottom cabin directly and plunged into the sea water. Buzz. As soon as it opened its mouth, a sound wave came out of its mouth and spread far away in the sea water. That's right, it is indeed a sonar system. Charles used his ability to connect to the spirit of the siren throughout the whole process. Once the siren sensed Xiao's location, Charles would know it immediately. Eric was on standby. After finding Xiao, he had to pull Xiao out personally. As for Rorschach, new mission generated. The mission is as follows. Thwart the actions of Black Emperor Sebastian Xiao and kill Xiao. Task reward. 2,000 origin points. At this time, a series of system prompts sounded in Rorschach's mind. A new mission appeared again. And this time the mission actually has a full 2,000 origin points reward, which can unlock 20% of the progress based on past experience. This is the largest reward since the template system was obtained. Rorschach is still very much looking forward to it. Xiao, it seems that it is unreasonable not to kill you. A gleam of light flashed in Rorschach's eyes. Then he also unbuckled his seatbelt and came to the bottom hatch to coordinate. He is not here to make a cameo appearance. At this moment, everyone in the fighter plane focused their attention on Charles, and everyone was waiting for the result from the siren. Almost 5 minutes later, Charles, who had been connected to the siren, was immediately excited. The siren has locked onto Xiao's position. Everyone in the fighter plane was also excited. Are you ready? Charles turned his head and looked at Eric on the side and asked. I've been waiting for this moment. Eric nodded heavily. Charles then told Hank, who was driving the fighter plane in front, the position of Xiao that he had sensed through the siren. Hank turned around and flew towards the sea above Xiao. Eric took this opportunity to climb out of the fighter plane, stepped on the fighter's landing gear, and stretched out his hand to sense the nuclear submarine under the water. Remember, the key lies somewhere between anger and calmness. Charles shouted to Eric on the side. I don't know if it was because of Charles's guidance or because Eric's strength had greatly increased after yesterday's transformation. He quickly sensed the nuclear submarine under the water. And using his own ability, he pulled the nuclear submarine out of the water. Splash! But under Eric's outstretched right hand, a huge nuclear submarine was suspended in the air, caught in Eric's hand, and flew towards the shore. The scene was indescribably shocking. Isn't Eric exaggerating? The Ravager in the cabin was dumbfounded and almost popped his eyes out. Eric's performance was indeed a bit too strong. God, what's going on? How did the nuclear submarine fly up? Look at that man, is it him? Even Eric's companions were shocked, not to mention the people in the two fleets of the United States and the Soviet Union on both sides of the embargo line. They all seemed to have seen a ghost, and felt that their three views at the moment were completely shattered. While they were extremely shocked, they also had deep fear and deep uneasiness in their hearts. When could a nuclear submarine be dealt with so casually and easily? The person on that fighter plane had such terrible power. If it was used against them, who could stop it? Threat. The people on the two fleets all felt a huge threat at the same time. What's going on? What happened? It's those guys. In a hall inside the nuclear submarine, the faces of 4 or 5 mutants all changed. As for the figure of Black Emperor Shao, he was not there. Because Black Emperor is now nestling in a secret room, fully absorbing the nuclear energy of the nuclear submarine. Then secretly launch a nuclear attack on one of the United States and the Soviet Union, thus completely triggering a nuclear war. The reason why Black Emperor decided to take action personally was because the Aral Sea freighter they controlled before was blown up. So Black Emperor and his men immediately realized that it was their old opponent, the group of mutants who came. How can this be? How dare you ruin our good deeds? A man with a naked upper body and a pair of eagle-like wings on his back uttered a cold voice. Then he climbed up the ladder without saying anything and opened the top hatch of the nuclear submarine. He turned his head subconsciously and saw a real good guy. The nuclear submarine actually went up to the sky. They were still diving under the sea, but the next moment it went up to the sky. He turned his head again and saw a man holding up their nuclear submarine with his hands. Obviously, it was Eric that Black Emperor had mentioned to them. It was indeed that group of people. A cold light burst out from the eyes of the eagle wing man, and then he spread his wings directly and flew towards Eric in a whoosh. On his wings, there was an exoskeleton that was like a dagger, which was used for attacking and was also very sharp. Eric was dragging the nuclear submarine with all his strength at the moment, so he had no time to deal with the eagle wing man. He could only watch the eagle wing man approach him. Fortunately, Rorschach was on the side to help Eric. Do you really think we have no one here? Rorschach sneered, leaned forward, and his pupils suddenly became fiery. Swish! 2 heat rays immediately shot towards the eagle-winged man. It's this guy. The eagle-winged man's face changed. Now Rorschach can be said to be a celebrity in the Black Emperor's side. Many of the Black Emperor's confidants know Rorschach and some of Rorschach's basic skills. Everyone knows that the man is very strong and is a big threat to the Black Emperor. The eagle-winged man is naturally no exception. So he dare not underestimate Rorschach. I hope everyone will support it and subscribe more.